It started as a simple conversation, but one glance, one pause, and suddenly, the line neither of us thought we'd ever cross was right in front of us. The story begins quietly, almost unremarkably. Just another late afternoon where the sun poured its last light through half-closed curtains, painting the room in muted gold. I had dropped by her house out of habit more than intention. She was my friend's wife, someone I'd always spoken to politely, with a kind of respectful distance. But that day, something felt different, though I couldn't place why. She welcomed me in with her usual warmth, her voice soft, carrying the tired edge of someone who had managed a home on her own for a little too long. Her husband, a man I admired, was away on a business trip, something that happened more often these days. I noticed how her smile lingered for just a second too long, as if grateful for company that broke the silence echoing through the house. We sat across from each other in her living room. She poured coffee for me, though the hour was too late for caffeine, and maybe that was the first unspoken sign that this wasn't about coffee at all. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, and yet every gesture felt heavier than it should. Her presence carried a quiet grace. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way her eyes softened when they met mine. It all struck me with a new weight I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't beauty in the loud sense, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that drew you in slowly, like a song you only realize you've been humming all along. We talked about little things at first. The noise of the neighborhood kids, the new shop that had opened down the street, the weather that seemed intent on ruining everyone's plans. But beneath each word, I felt an undertow, a subtle current pulling me closer to something I wasn't sure I should want. At one point, her hand brushed against mine as she passed me the sugar. It was the lightest touch, barely there, but my pulse stumbled. She didn't pull away quickly. Instead, her fingers lingered for half a heartbeat, long enough to leave a question hanging between us. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was alive. The ticking of the clock on the wall grew louder, and I became acutely aware of the rhythm of my own breathing. She looked at me, her eyes holding something unspoken, and for a moment the room felt impossibly small, as if the walls had drawn closer just to witness us. Inside, I fought with myself. This was wrong, I told myself. She was married. I was just a friend, a visitor. And yet, part of me wondered why my chest felt both heavy and light in her presence, why the world outside the window suddenly seemed irrelevant. That afternoon, nothing happened that anyone else would call remarkable. And yet, as I left her house later, the echo of that lingering touch and the weight of her gaze followed me home. Something had shifted, subtle, silent, but undeniable. It was the beginning of a story neither of us had planned, born from nothing more than one ordinary day that didn't feel ordinary at all. The next day, I told myself not to think about it. That moment when her fingers lingered on mine, that silence that seemed to breathe between us. It had been nothing, I tried to convince myself. Just a brush of skin, just a look held a little too long. But denial is a weak shield. The truth was, I had carried that feeling home, and it hadn't left me since. When she called the following afternoon, her voice light but edged with something I couldn't name, I didn't hesitate. She asked if I could stop by again. She had baked too much bread, she said, and it would be a shame to let it go to waste. It was the kind of casual excuse no one could question, yet something in the tone of her words told me it wasn't about bread at all. Her living room was just as I'd left it. Neat, cozy, the faint scent of coffee still clinging to the air. But the moment I stepped in, I could feel the same unspoken weight settle between us, as if the house itself remembered yesterday and was waiting to see if we'd dare cross that invisible line again. We sat closer this time, not across the room, but side by side on the couch. She placed the bread on the table, slicing it slowly, carefully, as though prolonging the small ritual gave her time to steady her nerves. I watched her hands move, graceful and sure, but I couldn't ignore the slight tremor when she finally handed me a slice. Our fingers touched again. This time, neither of us pulled away. The conversation drifted, at first harmless. We spoke about her husband's trip, how long he would be away. She laughed lightly as she told me how she'd grown used to sleeping on one side of the bed, leaving the other untouched as though saving it. The laughter faded quickly, though, replaced by a silence that seemed to weigh on her shoulders. I asked her if she was lonely. The question slipped out before I could stop it, my voice quieter than I intended, carrying more meaning than I had meant it to. She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes soft but searching, as though trying to decide if she could trust me with the truth. "Yes," she whispered, just one word, but it was enough to shift the air around us, to tighten the invisible thread that had been pulling us closer. Her vulnerability made my chest ache. I wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to tell her she wasn't alone. But I hesitated, afraid of what such a gesture might mean. Instead, I offered her my presence, my listening. She spoke slowly, cautiously, about the weight of being left behind, about the silence of nights that stretched too long. As she spoke, I noticed the way her voice softened, the way her shoulders eased as though a burden had been lifted just by being shared. Without thinking, I reached over, my hand brushing against hers on the couch cushion. This time, she didn't just allow the touch. She turned her palm upward, letting my fingers settle into hers. It was such a small act, yet it felt like crossing an ocean. Neither of us said anything more about it, but the warmth of her hand in mine told me everything words couldn't. That evening, when I left her house again, the echo of our joined hands lingered like a secret I wasn't ready to confess, even to myself. The next few days unfolded with a rhythm I hadn't expected. I told myself I'd stay away, that 2 visits had already towed the edge of something dangerous. But her presence lingered in me, pulling me back like the faint echo of a song that refuses to fade. It was late afternoon when I found myself at her doorstep again, this time without invitation. The sun was dipping low, casting the living room in amber light when she opened the door. For a moment, she seemed surprised, her lips parting as if to question why I was there. But instead of words, she stepped aside gently and let me in. That quiet acceptance felt like its own kind of welcome. We didn't rush to speak. She busied herself with the kettle, the clinking of cups filling the silence. I sat at the table, my gaze drawn to the simple gestures she made. Tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, the delicate curve of her wrist as she poured hot water. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was ordinary, painfully ordinary. And yet, every detail pressed deeper into me. When she finally sat across from me, our eyes met and lingered. That unbroken gaze said what our mouths couldn't. A question, a warning, a longing. We talked about small things at first, the weather, the neighbors, her husband's return date. But beneath the surface of each word ran a current we both felt, pulling us steadily closer. I found myself leaning forward, my hands folded on the table, and noticed how she mirrored the gesture, her fingers barely inches from mine. The tension was no longer subtle. It was thick in the air, heavy in every pause between words. Then came the silence. It wasn't awkward, it was charged, alive. The kind of silence where hearts speak louder than voices. I wanted to reach across the table, to trace the outline of her hand with mine, to close the small distance that had grown unbearable. But instead, I asked, softly, "Do you ever regret it?" I wasn't sure what I meant. Marriage, choices, or the loneliness she carried. Maybe all of it. Her eyes glistened as she looked away, her lips pressing together as if to hold back a truth too heavy to release. Finally, she shook her head slightly and whispered, "Sometimes, I just wish things were different." Those words struck deeper than I expected. Not because they revealed dissatisfaction, but because they carried vulnerability, the courage to confess a longing without naming it. I reached out then, unable to stop myself. My fingertips brushed hers, a tentative touch that sent a ripple of warmth up my arm. This time, she didn't hesitate. She turned her hand fully into mine, her fingers curling softly around my palm. We sat there in that fragile closeness, hands entwined, neither of us daring to break the moment with words. Outside, the sky darkened, shadows stretching across the room. Inside, it felt as though time itself had stilled, holding us within the fragile cocoon of something we weren't ready to name. When I left that night, her touch still clung to me, like a promise, or maybe a warning of how far we had already gone. It was a rainy evening when I saw her again. The kind of rain that softened the edges of the world, making the streets quiet and the air thick with the scent of wet earth. I hadn't planned to visit, but as I walked past her house, the glow of her window pulled me in, a quiet invitation I couldn't ignore. When she opened the door, her smile was small but warm, as though she had been expecting me. She stepped aside without a word, and I entered into the gentle hush of her home. The sound of rain pattering against the roof filled the silence between us. Not heavy, not awkward, just intimate. She offered me a towel for my damp hair, her fingers brushing my forehead lightly as she tucked a stray strand aside. The touch was brief, almost motherly, but the heat it left lingered longer than it should have. I caught her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, neither of us looked away. We settled on the couch, close enough that the warmth of her body reached me, though we didn't touch. A small lamp lit the room, throwing soft golden light across her face. I noticed the fine lines near her eyes, the faint tiredness there, but also the quiet strength, the grace she carried without effort. Our conversation drifted toward the personal. She spoke of her younger days, of dreams she once held that had slowly given way to obligations. I listened, really listened, as her voice carried both pride and regret. There was a softness in her tone, a confession hidden beneath her words, that life had not unfolded as she had imagined, and in some quiet corner of her heart, she still yearned for more. I found myself sharing, too, my uncertainties about the future, the weight of expectations I hadn't yet figured out how to meet. It surprised me how easily the words flowed, how natural it felt to bare the unpolished parts of myself to her. She didn't judge. She simply listened, her eyes fixed on me with a kind of attention I wasn't used to receiving. At one point, the power flickered and went out, leaving us in near darkness, save for the glow of the rain-muted streetlight outside. Instinctively, she shifted closer, her arm brushing against mine. The contact was subtle, but in the silence of that dim room, it felt electric. I turned slightly toward her, close enough to catch the faint scent of her perfume, something floral but grounded. Her breath was steady, but when I looked at her, I saw her chest rise a little quicker, betraying the calm mask she wore. I didn't reach for her hand this time. Instead, she did. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her fingers slid into mine, clasping with a quiet certainty. The rain beat harder against the glass, but inside, the world narrowed to the warmth of her skin pressed against mine. We didn't speak of what it meant. We didn't need to. That single act of closeness said enough, that the line we once danced around was fading, and in its place grew something neither of us dared name aloud. When the lights came back on, she didn't move away, and neither did I. The rain had passed by the next time I visited, but the weight between us hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown heavier, like a secret that kept demanding space. I told myself I was only dropping by to return the book she had lent me, but I lingered at her doorway longer than I should have, hoping she would ask me in. And when she did, I stepped inside with a relief that almost felt like guilt. The afternoon light slanted across her living room, warm and forgiving. She had brewed coffee, the scent filling the space, rich and grounding. We sat side by side on the couch again, our bodies naturally finding that quiet closeness we no longer questioned. She handed me a cup, her fingers grazing mine with a slowness that felt deliberate. Neither of us pulled back immediately. Instead, we let the touch stretch into something more than accident. My pulse quickened at the warmth of her skin against mine. It was astonishing how such a small contact could unravel me. Our conversation carried us gently forward, but beneath the words lay something unspoken, pressing harder with every glance, every pause. She asked about my childhood, about my family, her voice curious, almost tender. I found myself telling her stories I rarely shared, and she listened as though every word mattered. There was a comfort in her presence, an ease that made honesty effortless. Then came the silence, the kind that wasn't empty but charged, pulsing with everything we hadn't said. Her gaze lingered on me, soft yet searching, and I felt myself leaning ever so slightly toward her, as though drawn by a force I couldn't resist. Her hand rested on her lap, fingers curled loosely, and before I could overthink it, I let mine drift closer until they brushed. She didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her palm upward, allowing my fingers to slip into hers. The warmth of her hand sent a quiet shiver through me, grounding and exhilarating all at once. I glanced at her then, and for a heartbeat, the air seemed to hold still. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, her thumb moved, the gentlest stroke across my hand. So small, yet it set fire to the silence between us. "I don't know what we're doing," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. There was no accusation in her tone, only vulnerability. "Neither do I admitted. "But it feels impossible to ignore." Her eyes closed for a moment, as if steadying herself, then opened again to meet mine. And in them I saw the same longing I felt, the same struggle between what was right and what was undeniable. We didn't kiss. We didn't even move closer. But the weight of her hand in mine, the way she let it linger, said more than 1,000 confessions could. It was a quiet surrender to a truth neither of us could name aloud, that we were already too close, and pulling away felt unthinkable. When I finally left that evening, the imprint of her touch burned in my palm, a reminder that the line we once tried to honor had blurred beyond recognition. The next time I saw her, the air between us felt different, heavier, sharper, as if the silence itself had begun to demand answers. I had told myself I would keep some distance, give her space, and give myself time to breathe. But the truth was I couldn't stay away. Every hour apart only made the pull stronger, like a tide that refused to recede. She greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Something about it carried weight, as though she, too, was wrestling with the same storm. Still, she let me in, and once again, we found ourselves in the sanctuary of her living room, a place that had quietly become ours. We sat close, our shoulders almost touching, the unspoken electricity between us stronger than ever. She asked about my day, my work, the small details of life, and I answered, though neither of us truly cared about the words. What mattered were the pauses, the way her gaze lingered when I spoke, the way her fingers toyed with the edge of her sleeve as though keeping her hands busy might stop them from reaching for mine. Eventually, she fell quiet, her eyes drifting to the window where the evening light was fading. "Do you ever think about what this is?" she asked softly. Her voice trembled just enough to betray the calm expression she tried to wear. I hesitated, my throat tight. "Every moment," I admitted. "But I don't have an answer." Her breath caught, and when she looked at me again, her eyes were glossy with unshed tears. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "I never meant for it to." I wanted to tell her I understood, that I knew the weight of the promises she carried. But I also wanted to tell her that I couldn't stop feeling what I felt, that denying it only made the ache sharper. Instead, I reached for her hand, my touch slow, deliberate, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Her fingers tightened around mine, holding on as though letting go would cost her more than she could bear. The silence that followed was unbearable in its intensity. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough I swore she could hear it. I could feel her warmth beside me, the delicate brush of her arm against mine, the faintest tremor in her hand where our fingers laced together. When she finally turned toward me, her face was inches from mine. I saw the conflict in her eyes, the fear, the guilt, the longing. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but instead, she exhaled softly, and the sound of it washed over me like a confession. I didn't move closer, neither did she, but in that fragile moment, it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of us, suspended on the razor's edge between restraint and surrender. Her hand slipped from mine then, but not in rejection. She brought it to her chest, pressing it over her heart as though to steady its frantic rhythm. "I can't," she murmured. And yet, even as she said it, her eyes told a different truth, that she already had, just as I had. That night, when I left her house, the ache in me was sharper than ever, the kind that comes from wanting something you know you shouldn't but can't stop reaching for. The days that followed felt stretched thin, as though every hour carried the weight of what had almost happened. I tried to distract myself, tried to bury the memory of her hand in mine, her breath so close to mine, the trembling in her voice when she whispered, "I can't." But it was no use. She lingered in me, a presence I couldn't shake. When she called one afternoon asking me to come by, I knew this meeting would be different. There was something final in her tone, something heavy that made my chest tighten before I even arrived. Her house was quiet when I stepped inside. No coffee brewing, no bread on the table. Just her, waiting in the living room with her hands folded in her lap. The look on her face was soft, but there was a sadness in her eyes that told me everything before she even spoke. "We can't keep doing this," she said gently. Her voice didn't tremble this time. It was steady, though it carried sorrow in every syllable. "I crossed a line with you, and I can't let it go any further. It isn't fair to him, and it isn't fair to you." The words stung, though part of me had expected them. I sat down across from her, close but not touching, the distance between us suddenly vast. "I know," I whispered. My voice felt small but honest. "I've told myself the same thing, but knowing it doesn't make it easier." She looked at me then, her eyes shining with unspoken emotion. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything we wanted to say but couldn't. Finally, she reached out, her hand brushing against mine one last time. The touch was tender, deliberate, a quiet farewell written through skin. "You've given me something I didn't realize I needed," she said softly. "To be seen, to be heard. I'll always remember that." I swallowed hard, fighting the ache in my chest. I wanted to tell her the same, that she had changed something in me, too, that she had shown me how powerful a simple connection could be. Instead, I let my fingers curl lightly over hers, memorizing the feel of her touch. We sat there like that for a moment, two people caught in the bittersweet stillness of goodbye. Then, slowly, she pulled her hand back, folding it into her lap once more. When I stood to leave, the house felt different. Not emptier, but quieter, as though the air itself had settled after holding its breath for too long. She walked me to the door, and just before I stepped out, she gave me a small smile, the kind that carried both gratitude and grief. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," I replied, and with that I left. As I walked away, the ache inside me remained, but beneath it was something else, an understanding. Some stories aren't meant to last forever. Some are meant to flicker briefly, to illuminate the hidden corners of our hearts, and then fade, leaving us changed in ways words can never fully capture. And though we never crossed the line fully, I knew we had stood at its edge together, and that alone was enough to leave a mark on both of us. Speech balloon. Sometimes it's the quietest moments, the ones no one else sees, that change our lives forever. If this story touched you, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more heartfelt true stories, because the next one might just feel like your own. 8.